Everyone, welcome to today's webinar in the AMATYC 2021 webinar series, Blending Remote Teaching Strategies with Live Face-to-Face Teaching. Our presenter is Maria Andersen, and this is sponsored by the National Math Summit. The views expressed by the presenter are not necessarily the views of AMATYC, and any commercial products mentioned are not endorsed by AMATYC. McGraw-Hill is the sponsor of this year's webinar series. If you are not a member of AMATYC and wish to join, we would love to have you. We are on amatyc.org. We have Facebook with a lot of activity posts on Facebook. Upcoming professional development opportunities, this year's conference, still planning to be live in Phoenix and then in Toronto next year. There'll be other webinars and traveling workshop opportunities, so be on the lookout for those.
Oh, yeah.
And the recordings of this and other webinars are found at the webinar section of the AMATYC website. So I will stop here and I will turn it over to Maria.
Awesome, awesome. Well, I was told to introduce myself. So for those of you who haven't met me before, I have been teaching in higher ed for about 25 years, I think. Mostly math, some chemistry, some education, some business along the way. I've taught online, hybrid, face-to-face, remote. I actually was teaching remote for many years prior to the pandemic. So when the pandemic hit, I did a lot of webinars to help folks get ready for teaching remote. And now I've been getting requests to help people go back to face-to-face. A lot of the techniques that you all have learned during remote teaching and online teaching, you're now thinking to yourself probably, hey, I like some of this stuff. So how do I unpack that and bring it back into a face-to-face classroom? And we can maybe even talk a little bit about how you deal with it when you have both. A couple of students who are remote and the rest who are face-to-face, because I've also done that for years. And that's not that hard to navigate actually in a classroom, as long as you have decent internet. So let's get started. Let's talk about blending remote teaching strategies with live face-to-face teaching. So I thought first I would ask the wisdom of the crowd. I want to know what you've been really liking, what's been working really well in your remote and online teaching during the pandemic. And what I'll have you do is type your answer in the chat, but wait to press enter until I say 3, 2, 1, go, and then we'll get all the answers at once. Okay, so I'm going to give you maybe 30 seconds to let me know what's been going well. What do you really like about it? And remember to hold your answers till I say 3, 2, 1, go. Three, 2, 1, go. There we go. Okay. Oh, there's some really lovely answers in here. I'll encourage you to kind of scroll through, but breakout rooms, group projects. I find breakout rooms are so much easier in an online world than they are face-to-face. I don't know about you. They're just so fast, right? Into groups, out of groups, boom, boom, just like that. The things that students can view on their own time, student hours on Zoom, the interactive PowerPoints, those are really fun. Yeah, if you design them right, those can be great. And those actually transfer really nicely to the face-to-face classroom as well. Individual meetings with students, online homework, chat gives students more ways to ask questions, using polls, flexibility, being forced to explore different technologies. Thanks for that one, Karen. I think that's important. I think it never hurts to get a nudge out of your own comfort zone when it's good for growth, right? I love Danielle's answer. It is harder for one person to dominate a conversation or a crowd. So private chat feature, yeah, that's a great one. That's a great feature of remote and online classes. And students who are out sick can still catch up. can still get the content. So these are all fantastic, fantastic ones. So what I'd like to actually talk about is, in particular, the things that are more active in the remote classroom, like having students answer things in chat, use polling questions, interactive PowerPoints. I think you can probably all kind of figure out how you would take recordings of lectures and use them with a face-to-face classroom. I mean, you can just assign them and then do different things in the classroom, but what do you do in the classroom if you do that, right? Many of you now have a full set of lecture recordings and you're probably thinking, I don't really want to give a lecture about this topic ever again. I'm kind of done with it. So what do I do instead? How can I capitalize on that in the classroom? So I thought what we would do is kind of focus on some guiding principles for active learning, and then how we transfer those principles back from remote to face-to-face, and then do the same thing for assessment as well. Like, how do we take some of the, and we'll talk about assessment a little later, how do we take some of those principles and transfer them back as well? So I wanted to do kind of a quick review. This is like a very, very short reminder about active learning and why it's so important and what is so important about it, so that we can kind of put ourselves in the right mindset. So there's a famous paper by Benjamin Bloom, who designed Bloom's taxonomies. And it's called the 2 Sigma paper, the 2 Sigma problem. And what he was doing was looking for what made group instruction more effective than anything. And what he actually found was that one-on-one tutoring was more effective than everything. So basically, this is his study in a nutshell, one slide. Tutoring with mastery techniques turned out to be 1 standard deviation greater than group instruction and 2 standard deviations better than a lecture, right? And so this was kind of a little bit groundbreaking, in that it kind of put lecturing in its place. But it's actually the studies that come after this that I find more intriguing. There's one called Learning from Human Tutoring. And again, I'm going to kind of give you the 2-slide summary of a 65-page paper here. But the 2 slides summary is that they found that it was actually an increase in the number of interactions, not the content expertise of a tutor, that made the largest difference in deep learning outcomes. So the tutor didn't turn out to need to have any content expertise, as a matter of fact, as long as they were good at fostering interactions with the students. They also found that when you gave students explanations prior to asking them questions, it didn't actually improve outcomes. The only time that it improved outcomes was when the students sought them out as a moment of confusion. So those little, words of wisdom or lectures or mini lectures, whatever, are most useful if we can bring the student to a moment of confusion first. There's a follow-up paper to this one called Why Do Only Some Events Cause Learning During Human Tutoring? And in this one, they dug deeper into this question of why is content delivery only important at some points? And it seems that students actually need to reach an impasse or a stuck point. And when they reach that point where they lack understanding, they're missing a specific piece of knowledge, that is the best time to deliver the knowledge, right? And I'm going to take a small aside here and just kind of use a personal anecdote. I think that we've all experienced this with children, spouses, or friends. We call it learning the hard way, right? It's always the case that, we've told somebody time and time again, if you don't do this first, if you don't do A, then B will happen to you, right? But B actually has to happen to them for them to ever learn to do A, right? So this is kind of the same thing. They have to get stuck on their own to really know that they need information. So we have 2 challenges here. We need to simultaneously increase interaction and impasse, right? And interaction is something we did particularly well. I hope all of you did this particularly well during remote teaching, because you learned all these new techniques for doing it, right? And so the trickier one is actually impasse. How do you bring an entire group of students to a moment of impasse when they all have different abilities and different background knowledge, and they had different study techniques and things like that? And so you can't really bring an entire group of students to Impasse, but you can make sure that everybody gets to Impasse at various points in your classroom experience, whether it's online or blended or face-to-face or remote. So I want to just ask you one more question. I'm going to put a little line across the chat here and ask you again to type your answer and wait to press enter. What techniques in your remote and online teaching do you think that you did that increased interaction or created impasse moments? Three, two, one, go. Okay, let's see. Interactive PowerPoints, surveys, breakout rooms, showing errors and reasoning good, polls, small group work, in-class exercises, quizzes prior to class, discussion assignments. Awesome. Desmos activities, a couple votes for that one. 3, 2, 1, go. Good. Breakout rooms, checking in with students, more challenging problems that are not in the homework. Yeah, I love that. And critical thinking questions to go with lectures. Great. So let's take that now and think about how we bring that back to the classroom. Now, certainly many of you mentioned PowerPoints, interactive PowerPoints in particular. This is not like a set of lecture slides, it's a set of questions, right? Questions that we would ask the students, put up the questions, students work on it. They give you a response somehow, work in small groups, whatever. Those can certainly walk themselves right back into a face-to-face classroom, right? If you made interactive PowerPoint decks during the pandemic, just walk them directly back into your classroom. I'm going to give you a couple tricks for how to get students to respond, though, because that part's going to be a bit different. Now, what we want to actually create is this kind of cycle of activate, challenge, engage. And so if we want to, especially to create those impasse moments. So one thing you want to think about in your strategy, regardless of modality, is how do you activate old concepts and confidence with easy wins? You should always try to start a class that way. This was actually really emphasized to me when I had a webinar with a music teacher, a world-class music teacher. And she said that it's super important, especially with novices, that they start practice with songs they can already play. Because if you don't start them with songs they can already play, then they have no confidence going into anything that's challenging. And I thought, oh, well, that's really one I could hear again over and over. Students really need that, especially in math, where so many of our students lack confidence, right? So first, activate old concepts and confidence with easy wins. Second, challenge those concepts with questions and problems that are designed to reach impasse at some point. And again, that's going to be at a slightly different place for all of your students, but you want to kind of level up the questions until you can get the students to stuck. That is the point where they will be most receptive to hearing information you're going to present to them. So whether that's with video lectures, whether that's in a live setting, if they watched videos ahead of time and then come to class, then you really want to just spend your class time challenging those questions with those questions to bring them to impasse. And then at the moment of impasse, that's actually a fantastic time to engage students with each other to solve problems and discuss, because them talking it out with each other, and then when they're done, you layering in a little bit of details is the best way to deliver that information. A better way to maybe remember this is just think about something like running an obstacle course. Before you run the obstacle course, you're going to warm up. So that's your warm up activity. And then you're going to come to an impasse in the obstacle course. And some people may get over that impasse just fine on their own. And some people may need a knee up from a friend to get over that impasse. And that's exactly what we want to create over and over and over, in all of our modalities. Okay, so you can think of it as activate, challenge, engage, or it's an obstacle course. Warm up, impasse, get some help. Okay, so let's just think for a second on, besides the PowerPoint activities, what else can we do in our face-to-face courses to get this activate, challenge, and engage? Again, I'm just going to put a line across the chat here, and we'll do this with a 3, 2, 1, go. So just type your answer and hold on a second before you press enter. I'll let you know when. Three, two, one, go. Okay, lots more group work. I see that coming out here loud and clear. Paired board work, Desmos activities, think, pair, share, great. Use easy questions first, nice. Practical questions they're gonna enjoy, model real situations, all fantastic ideas. Okay, so let me walk you through a few of the techniques that I've been using in classrooms for a long time. For some of you, this is just gonna be like, oh yeah, review, I remember this one. But never hurts after a year of blended and online teaching to be reminded, right? So first, a very simple way to do this is with classroom lapboards. And there's lots of ways you can get a hold of these cheaply, shower boards, and just buying a classroom set and carrying them around in a suitcase. These simple classroom lapboards come in a couple different sizes. But this is a great option because it doesn't matter what kind of classroom you get, you can use this as a response system, right? And so I'm going to show you kind of how this works. So I might start out with a question like this one. Here's a function. With your partner, write down 6 properties of this function on your whiteboard, right? So that might be how we start. It might look like that. And that's maybe 5 or 6 answers there. As soon as the first pair has answered their questions, I'm going to move on to a next question. Oh yeah, that's how it looks. That's how it looks when they're working in the classroom on their paired boards. The next thing I'm going to have them do is trade boards with somebody and see if they can get to 12 properties of this function. Trading boards means they have to kind of evaluate somebody else's information. It might spark some ideas they hadn't thought of. And I know that I can get to at least 15 here. So I'm trying to create an impasse. I'm trying to get them stuck somewhere where they couldn't remember more properties, right? But the act of listing the first ones gives them some confidence too, because everybody can usually list a few properties. Once we get through 12 properties, we're actually going to make another board trade with somebody new, and then they're going to assess the work of the board they have. So now the pair of people goes through each property on the board they have and gives them a +1 if they think it's right, maybe a half if they've misspelled something. They always decide what their criteria are. They're much worse graders than I am. Meaner anyways, not worse, meaner. Or 0 if they don't like the property. And then as a final check, a way for me to layer in some detail where people might have missed something, I go through a list of properties and we talk about individual ones they have questions about. I point out specific things like, oh, if they've written down an axis of symmetry, it better have X equals on it. Did it have X equals on it? If not, give it at least half off, like things like that to emphasize detail and wording, vocabulary, etc. Right? So that's like a really quick activity you can do with a lap board. If you want interaction inside your classrooms, though, you have to constrain the response mechanism so that sharing must happen between students. If you give every individual student their own board, they won't talk to each other. If you give every individual student their own worksheet, they won't talk to each other. And so this is where it's a little hard because we have this tendency to be like, oh no, everybody gets their own worksheet. And you can do that. I just wouldn't give it to them all up front. So I usually start with giving students a response mechanism in pairs or in groups. So if you're trying to get them to do group work, maybe only give them one sheet of paper where the assignment is. So if this is what it looks like, by the way. If you only give them one sheet of paper, notice how closely these students are working together now. You know, this was probably not what we wanted to do during COVID, but this is what you want to see when a group of students is working together, right? So I would just make sure you remember that if you're giving out group work and none of your groups are actually functioning as groups, remember this picture. To get them to function as groups, you have to give them a common piece of paper, a common response mechanism like a board, something where they have to interact to get it done. If you let them get it done individually, they're not going to interact with each other. That's just human nature. So activate, challenge, engage. Here's another way we can get to that. If you're lucky enough to have a classroom with a lot of whiteboards around the room, then you can have them do paired work on the boards. This is super easy. A few of you mentioned it in the chat. The way I usually do it is the first time we do it, I just say, everybody stand up and walk to a whiteboard. Don't tell them what's happening, I just tell them to go. And then I say, okay, the person nearest to you is your partner. Make sure you have a partner, and then make sure you have a marker. And then I will put a question up on the board, or I will read a question out loud. One person is the writer, one person is the helper. Together, they have to solve the problem, right? And then and I could actually monitor the entire room this way, right? It's very low tech, it's very convenient. It's the same thing as walking around the room while they're answering on a lapboard. So if you aren't lucky enough to have a classroom like this, you can use lapboards for this and just walk around and see what's going on the boards in your room to get all your steps in during the day. And then once they've finished a problem, you have them swap, so the other person writes and helps, and then give them a different problem. And this is really nice because you can gauge pretty quickly whether they have a good understanding of the problem you just gave them or whether they're really struggling. And so you can choose your next problem to either ramp them up quite a bit or just ramp them up a tiny bit, because you're just trying to get to impasse, right? If they can still do the problems on their own, they aren't to impasse yet. And you actually want to get them to the point where they're all kind of like, I don't know what to do in this situation. How would I solve this? And they might poke at it a little bit from a couple of angles. That's the best thing you can do for their learning, right? At that point, that's the moment to say, okay, just put aside your lapboard or come back to your seat for a second. Let's talk about this. And we'll take a few notes and then I'll send you back to finish this problem, right? So you just kind of like put it aside, come back and get a little bit of help, and then go back to the problems and work a few more, right? So this is a really nice strategy for doing board work. When you're done with one set of board work, and this works for the lapboards too, actually. So just, you can use the exact same technique if they're using lapboards. Just decide on a pattern of rotation in your classroom. So this is how it works. When we're ready to switch partners, which we do every 2 problems, then you just say, okay, I need one person in each group to raise their hand and be the traveler. So they pick who's the traveler. And then in this case, they're all just going to rotate. I'll play it for you so you can see it.
Okay, so let's send the traveler to the next group so we can do the rest of the problems. And now make sure you introduce yourself to your partner.
So that's always the way it goes. And for the first several weeks of class, I remind them to introduce themselves to their partner because it helps them break the ice. Breaking the ice is a really difficult thing to do with a stranger, so it gives them some practice. So with lapboards, you just do the exact same thing. You say who's the traveler. The traveler stays the same for the whole class. And then you just say what the pattern is. So you say like, okay, we're going to travel up this row, down this row, up this row, down this row, or whatever. Once you establish the pattern, they know what it is after the first couple of days, and they always just travel the same way. So it's pretty fast. It's kind of like what we do in Zoom, where we can just like throw students into a new group. This is a way that we always know what the pattern is. We always know how to put students into new groups. There's always a traveler. They always move. It's very fast, right? So it simulates that same kind of thing.
Okay, so let's send the traveler to...
I can't seem to get to my next slide. There we go. Just as a reminder, they can also take pictures of things, whether they do them on the lapboards or whether they do them on the whiteboards. Almost every student we have has a phone or has a friend with a phone in class, or you have a phone in class. Somebody's got a phone, and you can take a picture and send it to them, or they can take a picture and send it to themselves or keep it in their photos, right? So if there's a problem they really want to save, they want to remember the work, they can always do that to make a record of that. Now there is an additional problem in a face-to-face classroom that we need to address, and somebody mentioned it in the comments. It's when a student kind of takes over for everybody else and starts answering for everybody else. So I thought we should revisit one more research study, which is one of my favorites. This is a study by Vilma Mesa about community college math instructors. And this is the study I always say that will haunt you if you've never seen it before. If you have seen it before, you know exactly what you're about to see. And she looked at what was going on in interactions in math classrooms. And so this is what you need to know. Questions are stars and answers are bubbles, okay? And the instructor's the triangle. Those are the three most important things to know. So here's a class that's been mapped over a full classroom session, so 50 minutes or 55 minutes. And there's the teacher up at the top, the triangle, who has asked a bunch of questions and answered 4 questions. And you can see each student in the classroom and how many questions they've answered. So for example, the student on the bottom left asked 1 question and answered 2 questions, right? So the question I have for you is, according to this map, how many students here are having a highly interactive experience? How many do you think? You can just give me an idea in the chat. Got a 3. We're gonna have groupthink now. Now that somebody's said 3. We're going to go with 3. I mean, yeah, those 3 students in the front row, you can clearly see they're having a highly interactive experience with the teacher, right? And a few students in the back row are answering things. And that second row, this second row is going to haunt you because you're going to realize very quickly that the second row often is not very interactive. It's a very safe place to sit. So if you ever want the safe place to sit at a conference, it seems to be the second row. Here's another classroom, different teacher, different students. Same thing, tracking it over a classroom session. The teacher, look at all the questions the teacher has asked. And how many students would you say are getting a highly interactive experience here? I'd have to say, I would have to say about 3 or 4 here as well. 3 in the front row, notice the pattern, and 1 in the back row. 3 in back, getting some good sleep time. Yep. And that second row, not very interactive, right? The important thing to note from both of these, though, is that from the teacher's perspective, if I was the teacher and I left this classroom never having seen this study, I would believe that I had a highly engaged class. I asked lots of questions and I got lots of answers. So from that perspective, it was a highly successful endeavor. It was, to my experience, an interactive lecture, right? As was this one before it. If I was the teacher there, I gave a highly interactive lecture. I asked, probably, I don't know, 10, 12 questions during class and got answers, right? That's interaction. It's important to recognize that because often we do have that feeling leaving class that everything went great. And it's only after seeing this study where you start to realize it didn't go great. Here's one more classroom, just for good measure. Teacher at the front there, the triangle, asking and answering a lot of questions, but this is pretty much a one-to-one conversation with somebody in the first row, right? And not a lot of interaction with the rest of the class. And so it's really important to see this because this actually illustrates a very natural property of communities. And we see it in online communities, which is where it was actually first recognized, but we see it in every one of these classrooms too. And that property is called the 1990 rule. And it says that in a room full of people, in a online chat room, or it was originally for online communities, I'll say, 1% of the people are creators. They make the posts, add the pictures, write the stories, do the Instagram, TikTok, etc. 9% are the commenters and sharers. They cheer on the people who are the creators. And then 90% of the community are lurkers. And if you go back and look at these classrooms now, can you identify the 1% that are the creators in each of these classrooms? Who is the creator? So there's a difference between the creator and the commenters sharers. Who's the creator? Yeah, Kathy's got it. Sonia's got it. The instructor. The instructor's the creator. You're creating the experience. Those 3 or 4 students you're interacting with, those are your commenters and sharers. It's about 10% of the room, right? A room of 30 students, 10% would be 3, right? So 3 students interact with you in a room of 30 students, and 90%, the rest of the class, lurks. That is the natural order of things. Watch your next dinner party and you'll see it in action now that we can have dinner parties again. Or the next time you go to a social event or something, just watch. You will see somebody is the creator. There's a few more who are commenters and sharers, and the rest are lurkers. Very natural. It's important to know that's natural, because if you want more interaction in your classroom, you actually have to combat this. You have to combat it dead on. And so techniques like using whiteboards where people have to interact with each other, or some of the things we've done in remote learning, like using the chat window, those are things that get us there. So in remote sessions, it's much easier to get responses from multiple students because we can use something like 3, 2, 1, go, right? It's a little harder in a face-to-face classroom because you can't have everybody talk out loud at once. So let's talk about some techniques that would work there. I'm just going to show you some examples of interactive questions I've used in remote classrooms. These are questions I would use just the same in a face-to-face classroom. So for example, looking at a set of data with a description, declare the meaning of the 2 variables. And when I do this one with 3, 2, 1, go, it looks something like this. Here are the variables that students have in here. And you can see they're pretty similar, actually. I would have the students do the exact same thing on the whiteboard, on a little lapboard, and then just hold up their answer like this so I can see them all at once. Or if I want them to work with each other, turn to people near them to share their answers, right? But if they just all hold it up to me and I'm at the front, I can scan the room the same way I would scan this list on a whiteboard. Stacy, your question, how do I ensure they all participate? I don't ensure they all participate, but I do kind of keep an eye on students who are not participating, and I'll nudge them in private chats. And in a classroom, it's actually a little easier because there's a bit more peer pressure to like hold up a board if everybody else is holding up a board. So, that, and usually I have more compares. So 2 people together write an answer and hold up their board, right? So here's another example, same set of data, let's find and interpret the meaning of this in a complete sentence. And so, here is, there are sentences for that. Find a linear regression model for the data. So again, there's regression models for the data. We can then talk about things like where to round, and notice that actually, this is the point where once Annabella has her answer there at the very bottom, which I hope you can see, then there's some recognition from the others like, oh, wait, I didn't use the right variables, right? So having them all answer is still super valuable in the classroom, because you can actually say, look around the room, one of you has a correct answer. And they'll all look around and they'll look at each other's boards, and then it'll hit them. Like that's that impasse moment, right? It'll hit them. Oh, I've got to remember to go back to the variables I defined. And here's one more, making a prediction in the future and writing their answer in a complete sentence. And you can see again here, we got lots of answers, and I'll say, yeah, I don't actually see a correct answer yet. And I'll go back and point them to, here's the problem again, read it carefully. And then eventually somebody will realize, oh, right, it was a complete sentence. Write your answer in a complete sentence, right? So, I mean, some of these are little details, but they're also the little details that students miss. They miss them on assignments, on tests, and in the workplace. Trust me when I say they miss these details in the workplace too. So it's important for them to get at that, right? So all of these things that we do with like a 3, 2, 1, go or poll question or whatever, if you were using techniques in Zoom to do this, you can do it in a classroom. You just have to have a way for them to show you an answer. Now, there are other more technical and less technical ways you can do it as well. So here's some other possibilities. You can use ABCD cards. It's like very low tech. So you can make some index cards with A, B, C, C and D on them, right? And they can just hold it up in front of them like this, right? I know you can also do it with 1, 2, 3, 4, but I actually have a hard time scanning the room for numbers. I actually find it much easier to scan the room for a capital letter that's all uniform in size and shape. It's kind of like scanning down a chat. And so if you want just something super low tech, again, I'm trying to give you some low tech options because you may already be juggling things like 2 students who are remote and a bunch of students who are face-to-face. So sometimes it's easier to be able to have the face-to-face ones hold something up and the online ones put it in the chat or something like that, right? So this can be very low tech, just index cards you take with you to class. You can use polling questions on phone or computer. There's a lot of different polling options, and some of your schools have very specific things they recommend or subscribe to. So it's important to go ask your Center for Teaching and Learning, like, what options do I have for doing something like polling questions? I thought I'd give you an example of a polling question here. I'm going to put it in the chat for you. This is a poll everywhere question. I think you should be able to just type your name and then hit continue to answer the question. I'm going to actually stop sharing my screen a second. Question, can they use graphing calculators? And I think that if you had a classroom where all the students had the common graphing calculator and the graphing calculators had polling options on them, then yes. I've never had a class in my life where they all had the same calculators. But now that I use Desmos in my classrooms, they do all pretty much have a phone or a computer. So, well, they do. It's required at our school that you have a computer. So, so I just have them use their phones for things. So I would use something like a Desmos activity, which I'll show you in a second. But I did want to go ahead and make sure that we reactivate this question in case it's not active. Activate, make sure there's. Are you seeing the question? I should ask you. Oh yeah, I'm seeing some responses now. Okay. And I'm going to pull this up on my screen so you can see the question. Again, I put the link to it in the chat. I'm only seeing one answer so far though. So if you aren't able to get to it, let me know. And you're just going to answer by clicking on the graph where you think it changes. It says waiting.
Yeah, the graph showed up briefly, then it disappeared.
Try hitting refresh, see if that does the trick. Oh, I see 2 answers now, 3 answers now. There we go. Sorry about that. I think I hit refresh and then knocked you all out. So I'm going to go ahead and share this so you can see what my view looks like. This can be a really nice way to do something. I can wait till you all respond, right? And then I can share it to show you what it looks like. Oh, let me put this full screen actually. So here are the answers I got. And you can see that they kind of cluster around a few regions here. And I will say that most of you are wrong. So let me actually clear it and let you have a second chance at it. This is what we call an impasse point, right? So I'm going to clear the responses and let you try again. Now we're clustering around 2 answers. So this would be like the perfect place in class to say, turn to your partner and talk about this, or talk about it at your table, or read the words in the question carefully and make sure that you've incorporated every word into your answer, right? And of course, the trick here is the word slope. Where does the slope change from decreasing to increasing? And the slope changes from decreasing to increasing at an inflection point, which is the point that's right around like maybe around 1/2, 1, yeah, maybe 0.6, 1, right? The graph changes from decreasing to increasing at that lower point that some of you have marked, but the slope changes from decreasing to increasing at this other point, right? So this is a perfect example of a question where I can very easily get a group of people, even a group of math instructors, to get to an impasse point and we can have a discussion about it, right? It's just very, once you get used to designing these types of questions, you'll develop some expertise on, and probably many of you who've graded papers for years already have this expertise. You know exactly where there's a break from perfect answers to imperfect answers and like what causes that break, right? So you can design questions to fall right into that valley. So that's just an example of a poll everywhere question. There are other types of questions you can do. You can do, you know, A, B, C, D responses. You can do, you know, in your own words kind of responses. So the types of things you would do in chat. Now it's not free. You would need to have a subscription, but there are lots of services like this, right? And that's why I said, go talk to your Center for Teaching and Learning, because there is probably something that your school subscribes to that you can use, right? And this is a good option for something like that. Now, I find that these really, especially as an adjunct or somebody who used to have, you know, 4 or 5 preps, that was just too much work. It was way easier to just make the PowerPoint slides and use whiteboards, right? It's a lower tech option, but it's just as fast. And we don't have all the issues with, you know, is it loading properly? Can everybody see it? Blah, 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 right? So I've found that, you know, low tech is actually one of the best things. Also, it keeps them thinking, connecting with you and writing with a pen and paper or a pen and a whiteboard. And I think there's a lot of value to that. So the other thing I was going to mention is Desmos activities clearly are also, let me share my screen again. Actually, let me just drop one in here. It's a similar one to something we've done. So this would be an example of doing one of these questions as a Desmos activity. And as a Desmos activity, we could get at a lot of the same types of questions. But again, it requires setting it up, right? So it really depends. Like if I had a whole bunch of classes, if I was doing the same prep or like 1 prep and 3 sections, that might be worth the investment. But if I was doing 4 sections and 4 different preps, I don't know that I would have the time to do more than maybe 1 class a semester to really keep up with doing something like this. Overall, the time investment is worth it in the long run, but not in a short run, right? So this is an example for a properties of log function, and I'm just gonna go to the student preview here. Oh, it's not active. I'll just show it to you. You can see it on my screen, I think. Hopefully.
Yeah,
Yep.
we can see it.
Yes.
Okay, so like this lists the properties of a logarithmic function. Here's, you know, list 6 properties of this function. Same thing I would do on a whiteboard, but you can just give them an empty space. And then once they all respond, you can show them all the answers, right? So something like that works as well, right? It just involves you setting up the questions. It took me about 4 minutes to set this up. Once you know what you're doing, but it's still 4 minutes that it was easier to just ask and hold up boards, right? And I know that at community colleges, we tend to be more time crunched than at 4-year colleges. So the other thing I'm gonna show you, I have tried before. Where did my PowerPoint go? There it is. And then view. Side. So you might ask, like, why wouldn't I use a chat room in a face-to-face class? And so there's a couple problems with that. One, you either have to get them all into a common platform. So you'd have to have like all your students join something like Zoom, which you don't want. And if you don't want very many students in a face-to-face classroom to be on Zoom, because the echo effect they get from each other's computers is horrid, right? So one of the things you want to do if you have some students who are coming in remotely, which will probably be happening for the rest of your teaching career, because they all know now it's a possibility. And if they have a sick child, a broken car, a weather issue, something happening at their house that day, they're going to say, can I just come to class remotely today? And that's going to be the new norm, I think. And I think we should allow that, because we all know that things come up in our lives too, and we should be more accommodating of students, I think. So what you want to do in those cases is try to not have more than one computer in the classroom that's accommodating those students that are remote. If there's more than one, that's ideal, because they can work together remotely. If there's only one that's remote for the day, I usually ask some student in the classroom to log into Zoom so that they can work with that student whenever group work or paired work comes up. And that way they're not on your computer working with the student, they're on their computer, and they can just mute themselves when they're not working. But why not chat rooms? There are some chat rooms out there like Chatzy and some other rooms where it's like, oh, you can have the chat experience in a large group. Every single time I have tried to do that with one of these rooms in an in-person setting, it treats it as a DDoS attack, because you have so many people coming into the chat room from the same IP address, and it shuts the room down. So to this date, I have not found one that will actually, like an independent chat room that will actually work in a classroom because of this problem. When every student logs in or starts to type from the same IP address, it's a security feature of the platform that it shuts down. So that's why I don't use chat rooms in the classroom. Also because I don't want them to spend their whole time chatting with each other in chat rooms. So I really want to pull them away from devices and get them thinking about math as much as possible, with the exception of the device that does the graphing for them. And that for me is their phone. And that's hard enough to manage without getting them talking to each other on chats. So when I do this in a face-to-face classroom, I typically go to low tech as much as possible. All right, so I'm just going to pay attention to time here. We have about 10 minutes left. So I can either kind of do a fast run through of how assessment might shift, or we can just take questions. So let's just see in the chat what you want to do for our last 10 minutes. Or if you have a question, why don't you ask it? Assessment. Okay, I guess that's unanimous. All right, so let's talk about assessment. I just want to give you some guiding principles for modern assessment. Probably many of you shifted your assessment when you went to remote and online. You did assessment in a way you probably never ever thought you would do in your career. You were always against it, maybe. Maybe you just expanded your mind some to accommodate what we had to do for assessment online and remote. This is how I do it. My assessments are way more data driven than they used to be. They use a lot more real examples than they used to. They are way more concept focused and less procedure focused. And there's a much higher focus on checking their work, like making sure their work is actually correct as part of the problems. So an assessment in person looks really different when you let them use resources like you probably did when they were online. So this is an example of a proctored test in one of my classes pre-pandemic. Notice they have their computers open, they're using Desmos, they might have a graphing calculator as well, they have their test there, there's a formula sheet to the right of the computer, right? Like each student has their little amassed resources there to use. The same resources I let them use when they were online. Now they're on their honor not to use anything but Desmos. And there is actually a Desmos test mode for Chrome that you can use if they're on a laptop. And there's a Desmos testing app for iPhones. I haven't gone to look recently to see if there's one for Android, but if somebody knows that there is one now, please let me know. And then just remember that not all assessment has to be tests. Like, I know we focus on tests in math, but not all assessment has to be tests. You can give projects, problem sets, essays, videos, take-home exams, right? Like these are all completely acceptable assessments. You might just use your tests to focus on skills you really want them to have in like down cold. and let other assessments stand in for other things, right? When you do give tests, I think you just have to be more creative about the problems if you're going to let them have resources. And again, I've been doing this for years now, and there's not any difference in the curves, letting them have the resources or not letting them have the resources, as long as you've altered your tests. And so these are some of the alterations I make. So one, I test concepts, not algebraic nightmares, as I call them. So I don't make them show me how to get from this quadratic equation in standard form to vertex form and factored form, but I do make them find those equations, which they can do cleverly with technology if they know what they're doing. So they could like graph it, find the vertex and put it in vertex form, put it in their calculator, make sure they got it right, right? They can graph it, find the intercepts and put it in factored form. And again, put it in their calculator to know that it's correct, right? That's testing the concepts. And that's what I want them to know, is that the equations relate to the graphs, right? I can ask them, I can get at algebraic steps when I need to see them by asking for two strategies. So one of them is typically graphing, and then the other one they default to as well. I've used my calculator, now I've got to do it some other way, so now I'll do it with algebra, right? Every once in a while, I find somebody who cleverly finds two different ways to use technology to do it, and trust me when I say that's usually a student who was going to get an A anyways. And then often I'll find that they'll show me how to solve this problem with two different logarithms. They'll do it with a natural log and a regular log, right? They've shown it to be twice with algebra. So it's really interesting to see like what they come up with, but I want them to have multiple methods to solve problems. So I really like this kind of question as well. You've seen me do the list properties question. So this is one that shows up in class a ton and it shows up on tests a ton. I want them to give me X number of properties. I usually figure out how many properties I could write and then ask for about 80% of that, right? And in class, you establish what you will accept and what you won't. Like if they give you like silly properties, like it's math, you can say, yeah, that's not acceptable. Yeah, so they typically get good at knowing what properties you would accept and what you wouldn't. They're working with their vocabulary, they're giving you results, they can rattle off properties for any graph. And I really like that because it means they're prepared for their other classes. I also, all of the problems are relevant scenarios now. So in the old world, I would have given this question on the right, find the equation of a line between blah and blah. Of course, Photomath does that, Wolfram Alpha does that, like all of these other pieces of software do that. Like, why are we testing them on the thing that the computers can do? No, let's test them on the thing they would have to do in the workplace. Like, given some data, see if you can find an equation for the line between those points, right? Translate the data into numbers, the appropriate numbers, define your variables, and give me the equation for the line, right? This is actually the exact same problem, by the way, once you define your variables. But the one on the left is more like what they would have to do in other classes and in the workforce. Another technique you can use is just to remove the answer altogether as the goal. So old world would be on the left here. We would just say find the derivative using the limit definition of the derivative, which of course then half the class shortcuts it and you don't know how to grade that. Give them zeros and they get mad because they did have the correct answer. So the way to get around that is just remove the answer. Give them the answer. To prove the derivative is this using the limit definition of the derivative. Then it's quite clear that they can't just like use the shortcut. Like you have to use the limit that's the whole problem now, right? And it also levels the playing field in case one of your students has a calculator with a computer algebra system on it. The computer algebra system would have given them the answer, right? So now you just leveled the playing field. Everybody has the answer. The work is getting there, showing that they can actually do the technique to get there. I often give them problems on tests now where I give them a graph and they have to find everything. They have to label the points themselves. They have to put it into a model themselves, declare the variables themselves, and come up with a model all by themselves. I will sometimes tell them what model it is, depending on what we're studying. So like this one in particular, I'm asking for a quadratic model for it. But this is the kind of stuff they do in their science classes, their economics classes, their business classes, and everything else, right? And this is the kind of stuff that those other teachers tell us. Students don't know how to do this. It's like you never taught them math, right? So I'm making them do the math they're going to do everywhere else. I often require that they sketch graphs on tests to emphasize to them reasonability. Like if they have to label the axes and add the scales and and write everything in, which is what I make them do on problem sets. I make them do it in class, like that they have to start paying attention to whether graphs are reasonable, right? And then another one is messy timescales. Again, this like foils every system in existence. In the real world, we don't have complete data. You'll be missing data. So notice here you have Q1, Q3, and Q4. You're missing Q2. You have to pay attention to the missing data. You can't just write 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 across the top. Now, you can't put this on tests unless you also do it in class, right? But I call this redefining the time scale. And we do it all the time in class, and we do it all the time in problem sets, and we do it all the time on tests. So they start every problem by basically re-indexing the time to something that's more appropriate for a model, because this is the way the data comes to them in all these other places and in the real world. If somebody on your team forgets to go snapshot your metric system on a particular date, and you're not willing to pay the $1,000 extra for the metric, then you now no longer have data on that date. And that's just the way it's going to go. So this is real world data. I ask them to interpret real world graphs. So I don't give them fake graphs and ask them to answer questions. I give them real graphs and ask them to answer questions. And I give them problems on, these are all test questions, by the way, give them problems with messy data. They have to decide which 2 points they're going to use. This creates some variation in answers. It creates some variation in the work, right? It becomes much clearer if there's like a lot of answer sharing. So it's a nice way to make sure, again, they can work with real world data. Piecewise, every problem in the world, every graph in the world became piecewise on March of 2020. Every pattern in the world changed, which means that every graph we have is now a piecewise graph, which is fantastic, because now they have to put 2 things together, right? If you're looking at any real world data, you can talk about trends pre-2020 and trends after 2020. You can say, well, what if now we have the same growth rate as pre-2020? What will the data be like in 2025? We can talk about all those words and things with graphs. So that's all, really fantastic. And really, if they can't do things with real graphs and real data, then what exactly is the point of what we're doing, right? So I've brought all of my in-person assessments, my remote assessments, everything to be much more data-centered, much more graph-centered from the real world. So if you're thinking to yourself, well, how do I find those graphs? I would just like to tell you that we run a little site called Graphs in the World. It's just it's nothing but graphs. That's the whole point of the site. I don't know, there's probably like 500 graphs there now. So if you just Google Graphs in the World, all one word, you will find it on, and this is what it looks like, by the way. It is just nothing but graphs. We always post the main graph as the picture on Instagram, so you can easily scroll and find a graph where you're like, oh, that graph. I want that graph for my class today. There's always a source, so you can find the original. Then we actually post it in 3 places socially. It's on Instagram, Facebook, and actually Twitter as well. So if you just search Graphs in the World, all one word, you can find it in those 3 places. Search it, use it to your heart's content, and incorporate them into all of your assignments. It has never been easier to find real world data than it is right now. And it's just everywhere if you start looking. So I'm going to stop there. Whew, we made it 2 o'clock, and see if you have any questions.
As Maria said, we are at the 1 hour mark. If anyone needs to leave, that's fine. But it's okay if we stay a little bit longer than an hour if there are some questions. Before people start leaving, Maria, thank you so much for another session full of ideas. If you've ever been to a Maria Andersen session before and don't leave with at least 1 or 2 ideas, then you're probably one in the back row sleeping on her. So if we could just give our appreciation to Maria in the chat or on mic, and then she will stick around and answer questions if there are some more questions.
Thanks.
I'm not seeing or hearing any questions.
Everybody's got plenty to do now.
No, out of a good session, you give them so much to do, they don't have any questions for you. Okay, if there are no questions, thanks again for attending. This PowerPoint and the recording will be shared very soon. And I guess that's it. Have a nice day. And Maria, thanks once again. It's very good.
I'll send you the link, Pat.
Thank you so much.